Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to have Claudette Fette with us. And we are going to look at some issues that I don't think we talk enough about, certainly in compliance, but it's around a lot of her work as an academician and in the corporate world. So, Claudette, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
You're welcome.
Claudette, could you tell us about your professional and academic background?
I started as a mom, which is what the book is framing. And when my son ended up on the streets at 15 after a bout in a really abusive treatment center, I started going back to school to figure out what we could do otherwise and really look for very practical kinds of things. And I came upon occupational therapy. And that's been a good fit. Practiced in lots of different areas, practiced in acute psychiatric hospital. I've practiced in homeless shelters, lots of community-based stuff, and in schools. Went back to school and got my master's in rehab counseling because it let me work in the community. OT is not necessarily recognized in Texas as a mental health discipline. And then went back and got my PhD and have kind of figured out that I can change the world better by teaching than trying to do it as a person.
Where do you teach?
Texas Woman's University.
Many of our listeners may not be familiar with that university. So could you say a few words about TWU?
Sure. Texas Woman's University is a university primarily for women. We actually have men as well. I work on the Denton campus, but we have a Denton, Dallas, and Houston campus. We're kind of now a system. And I work in the School of Occupational Therapy, teaching all things mental health.
Was it your son's journey, your journey, a combination of both, or something else which led to No Saints Here?
So Aaron started writing the book about 10 years before he died. He was a guy with serious mental illness and addiction who landed on the streets at 15 after that treatment center. His hope was to get the word out on the troubled teen industry and to save others from what we went through there. My goals included, and we talked about writing this for years, and I really didn't want him to be a poster child, but after he died, it seemed appropriate. And so my goals are both highlighting abusive and ineffective practices that desperate families kind of get sucked into, and to share our experiences with other families, with professionals, policymakers, and providing information on best practices that serve children, families, adults better.
So, what are some of the community based alternatives to institutionalization that you've either been a part of or you might advocate on a go forward basis?
Alternatives to institutionalization, Wraparound was developed in the 80s as an alternative to we were sending loads of kids to residential treatment centers and not getting very good outcomes. So it was a practice that was created for that. Also, so depends on which system that you're in, also would advocate a lot. We have a lot of our mental health system is kind of twofold. For adults, it is in the community, but we have as many beds, acute psych beds in the criminal justice system as we have anywhere else. And so you kind of have to talk about both of those in tandem. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, what's the importance of, let's go to staffing and multidisciplinary staffing? Why is that such a critical need to fill?
In Texas, funding staffing that is skilled is a number one priority. Multidisciplinary staffing helps. So whereas when I worked in acute psych, they used to hire skilled licensed staff across multiple disciplines. Right now, often that acute level of care is provided by techs that may not have any more training than what they're provided by the facility itself. But beyond all that, different disciplines bring unique lenses. So, for example, psychologists and others taking a behavioral point of view are going to look at consequences of behavior when they're trying to kind of figure out what's driving it. I'm an occupational therapist. We often look at antecedents of behavior and how do I provide accommodations to enable people to participate. And then psychiatrists, nurses will take a more medical point of view. And all of us together, bringing all of our different lenses, are provide a fuller picture of what's going on and a fuller array of supports because not everybody needs the same thing.
I'd like to turn to early intervention, preventative mental health support. I think most of our listeners will understand the term early intervention, but let me move to preventative mental health support because I'm not sure that we discussed the preventative part of mental health support enough. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
So, what we know is that when it is needed, the earlier that supports can be provided, the better the outcomes. So, the goal is really to prevent mental health problems wherever possible. That could begin with the as early as looking at the identification of at-risk parents. I was a teenage mom, then my husband had a psychiatric break, my first husband, and landed in jail. We were at risk because of my age. I had a history of delinquency in adolescence. Aaron's father had a history of mental illness and subsequent incarceration. All of those are red flags that could have been an opportunity to say, what kind of supports can we put into place? Visiting nurses, any number of things. What we know is that families like mine don't give birth to children with mental health needs because they're expertly prepared. We come with whatever parenting we were given, and if that's adequate, great. Often it's not. Often our kids need special skills. Another place that we could have intervened, Aaron was kicked out of multiple daycare centers. Another opportunity, another red flag that tells you there could be issues. I needed a really sophisticated skill set, but instead I did what I knew, which was a lot of yelling and some spanking because that's kind of what's out there. It worked okay for myself and my brother. It did not work for Aaron.
So, how do you bring these skills to an elementary school or elementary school teachers? Say things like teaching emotional literacy and restorative practices in grade school. Is that something that we are teaching? And if not, how can we help teachers in those skills?
So teachers have a really hard job and need a whole lot of support. Think about a public health model, which is basically a triangle when you're thinking about early intervention and prevention. In schools, this is called multi-tiered systems of support. At the base of that triangle are universal support. So they're things that you want to provide to every kid to try to prevent any kind of mental illness or just to promote health. And those are things like social and emotional learning, teaching them having an emotional language, using restorative circles to teach conflict resolution, and to take responsibility for harm that they've caused. And you can do that with all children. At tier 2, which is the second level on that triangle, you're trying to catch kids who maybe have a particular risk factor. Maybe they have experienced some trauma or abuse, or maybe they have learning disabilities, which school failure is a big issue in terms of risk factors for mental ill health. You look at helping them be successful in school. That's one of the big things you can do is provide the accommodations so that they can experience themselves as competent because we all want to be competent. And so providing that for kids, providing trauma-informed practices for teachers. A big thing we can do in terms of policy is really encourage disciplines. So in schools, a broad swath of disciplines that work in schools as support staff are called specialized instructional support personnel, or SISPs. OT is a SISP, so is a librarian, so is a school psychologist, all kinds of us, to really focus the school on providing early intervention, or what we call response to intervention. So as soon as there is any kind of problem, to be able to swoop in and provide the supports for that. That means supporting teachers because they're in the front lines and they see what's going on. So you want to be able to get in there, have a good relationship with teachers, and be able to get in there and support them however they need quickly. And for instance, when I was a school-based practitioner, we did response to intervention, which is an early intervention model. And the teacher could call me and say, I don't know what's going on with Johnny, but could you come take a look? And I could be there within a week and do some observation, give her some strategies, and we could see how well those worked and kind of keep checking in and tweaking. I think teachers are kind of stuck out on their own a lot. So whatever we can do to provide support, and there actually are quite a few disciplines in schools. Historically, when we started with special education, many of us went in with a clinical model. And so we were just doing people in that third tier, which are once they have a problem identified, we kind of waited for kids to fail and then we picked them up and then had them in a caseload like you would in a medical setting. Instead, we need to, in schools, work from a workload model so that we can be flexible and serve kids wherever they are and teachers.
Could I turn from the educational arena to maybe a little bit more focus on the criminal justice system? And how can we use how can we help either substance abuse, mental illness to move back from looking at it from a criminal perspective and move to some sort of restorative approach? Is that something that you either think about, help companies with, or even the government?
Yeah. Substance use, or the criminalization of substance use, has been an abject failure. We have a lot of data to demonstrate that putting millions of people in prison for drugs has really not done anything to curb abuse, and it's torn communities apart. So with the opioid settlement money, there is, in theory, more treatment available. But if you think about the reality of people in the midst of substance use, they may or may not be able to jump through all of the intricate hoops that it takes to access that. But they sure are going to run up against law enforcement pretty easily. So you think about kind of where they end up, and very frequently it's going to be in law enforcement. We have underfunded mental health in the community and mental health supports, but not law enforcement. And much of what we do ends up being there. You can deal with that by having kind of deferment directly. So if somebody comes into the system, then you can do a deferment kind of process. The restorative practices are about, so if you think about what we do in criminal justice right now, someone comes before the court or they commit an offense. They go before the court. There is an attorney that they hire that represents them, and whoever is harmed, whether it's the state, the community, or a person, is represented by the state, and those two do battle. And the actual people that were part of all of that are completely divorced from it. Add to that the fact that it's common practice to kind of ratchet up the charge so that the person will plea bargain and they don't have to go to court at all. And you have kind of a system where they are completely detached from what is going on in that process. So restorative justice says people need to be able to make it right. So if I commit a wrong, I need to be able to think about what I did and be able to come up with a restorative action to make that wrong. Victims of crime do not have a voice in that system at all. So it's also about redressing them and making sure that they get what they need. And whoever was harmed, whether it's family, community, whatever. So restorative justice is a lot about really shifting that whole process to create something where people come out of the system better. We know that while many people with mental illness come in contact with the justice system, it is a dangerous place for them, and it's frequently not a place where they get better. They tend to be in solitary confinement more often, which makes them also really expensive. I saw estimates of about $75,000 for a year for a person with a mental illness, just due to the different kinds of putting them in administrative segregation, which is solitary, which we also know worsens their mental health. It's not very effective, and it's really expensive. We could spend that money more effectively if we spent it in the community.
Let me change the focus a little bit because you've used a term that I was not familiar with, and that term is
Mhm.
authentic wraparound.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what that is and how we might think about that in the context of, I'm going to use the term recovery, but you may choose a different term.
So recovery and wraparound have a huge overlap. Wraparound started with children and youth because we were sending an awful lot of kids away to residential treatment in the 80s, and they were not getting better. And folks said, we ought to be able to do something better with that money because it's very expensive if we wrap it around them in the community. And so they began in many different parts of the country to develop this process. It evolved with very specific principles to kind of hold it accountable. So you hear the term wraparound all over the place. That doesn't mean that it is actually wraparound that they're practicing. There are a set of principles, frankly, also for recovery that are kind of overlapping. But principles in wraparound, for example, include strength-based practice. Strength-based is a principle that I have seen not authentically used in wraparound practice when the facilitator brought the kiddo in and we had a team meeting and they said, okay, here's your name, and we're going to make an acronym with just random strengths that they used for each of the letters of his name. And then that kind of checked the box. Okay, we've done strengths, and they put it away. That's not strength-based practice. Strength-based practice is at its heart looking for strengths that child and family or adult and others around them really can own, and then creating what Kathy Cox calls enabling niches. So places where they can practice those strengths, a demand for those strengths in the community so that they can build and broaden those rather than focusing on deficits that, unfortunately, when we focus on, sometimes we tend to broaden too. We want to kind of broaden their capacity and their ability to feel competent. So that's strengths is one of the principles. Family voice and choice, which means families drive their plan and are integral to the entire system. Unconditional care. So in wraparound, no kid gets kicked out. You just figure if it doesn't work, then you go, okay, that didn't work. What are we going to do instead? It is a team-based process. So all of the decisions happen in a team, but half of that team is non-professional. It's really a time-limited process. You have 50% of the team are neighbors, grandma, aunt, somebody, cousin, someone else, a friend, whatever, people who are going to be there way after the professionals are gone. And that's another piece that's really hard and very frequently I see left out. So following all of those 10 principles of wraparound and adhering to them are how practitioners hold themselves liable or responsible for authentic or high fidelity is the word wraparound, and how systems hold themselves accountable. Unfortunately, we have a lot of wraparound or things that we call wraparound that aren't. And then you really have to look at if the outcomes aren't great and you're not doing it, you've really injured a successful process because people are going, oh, I've done that wraparound. It doesn't do anything. But they didn't. And we do a lot of that.
Let me change the focus yet again to the writing and publishing process that you went through and ask you if you could share your experience in working with Stony Creek.
It's been good. So I initially started writing, first transcribing Aaron's stuff and then writing my story and then writing about evidence-based practices in each of those parts. And I had many people read it and they all said, "This is great. That gives you absolutely no information to work from." So I really appreciated having the editorial support to really look at things critically and help me pull this together. It's been a great process.
So could you describe a little bit about your website and the blog you have at aaronvoices.com?
Yeah. So I started that because it took me a while to get the book written. And I wanted to have that information out there quickly. And so it follows the book has kind of three pieces. The first piece is Aaron's voice, and that is poetry on the website that he has written. And then the second piece is my blog addressing various different issues that are salient. And then the third part is perhaps the most important, and that is the resources page. And that was a way for me to get those resources, although I still owe it some, to get those resources out there ahead of the book because the book took a number of years to write.
Any thoughts of having a podcast?
I have thought about it. I'm going to have to pick your brain and figure out how, because I don't know what to do with that. I need to be better at keeping up with that website. Perhaps I need to first keep up with what I've got. But I've thought about that. I listen to podcasts all the time. I've thought about it because it's a really nice, easy way to learn things. Yes, I have.
Claude, I would just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to end by asking if there's one policy change you could make with either a lightning bolt from Zeus or your magic wand, what would it be?
So I have a hard time limiting it to one. I would say it could go down to two. One, that we siphon the money that we spend in criminal justice and shift it for people with mental illness and shift it into mental health. So if we could figure out a way from a policy perspective to look at those two silos in tandem, or at least the part of them that are both spent on people with mental ill health. And then my other one would be that we need strong, independent, family-run organizations that are accessible to families in every county. And they need to be families who are well-informed so that they can guide in best practices. And that's particularly important because although I have a particular discipline, I am myopic in that I look at things from my perspective. Family partners are pulling that from everywhere, and they also have a lived experience. Both of those are things I think that are critical, and I had a hard time when you asked me that earlier to consider that earlier. I had a hard time limiting it to one.
Claudette, unfortunately, now we are at the end of our time. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out any more information about your book or the topics we touched on, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Probably the website. Probably to go. It is Aaron, AARON dash voices, VOICES.com. And it does have a place to contact me there as well. I teach at TWU, so my email is cfette@twu.edu. So either of those are good places to keep up with. The book is available through Stony Creek and A&M Press and Amazon, or how to get to all three of those.
All right, Claudette, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me.
Thank
I
you.
will talk to you about starting a podcast, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Okay. Thank you.